Well, welcome to the Oculus International video series. I'm Iain Wilson, Managing Partner. I'm here today with David Bissett. He's a partner of Crimson & Co. Today we're going to be discussing the digital revolution within the supply chain. And David, maybe kick us off and just give us a 1 minute of your background so the audience knows who you are.
Yeah, morning everyone. As Iain said, my name is David Bissett. I'm a partner leading the Sydney office for Crimson & Co. We're a global management consultancy focused on operations, supply chain transformation. Beyond that, we're part of a larger consulting organisation called the Iain Group, the biggest specialist supply chain consultancy in France. Digital operations or digital innovation in the supply chain operations space is something that the business has been really focused on the last 12 to 18 months, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you, Iain, today about where we see that going and what influence it may have in operations here in Australia.
There's obviously a lot of talk in the market just generally about AI or machine learning or cognitive systems and that sort of thing. I mean, what are you seeing for the supply chain in the world, really, that is not in Australia, or things that supply chain professionals need to think about with regard to the digitisation of their supply chain?
Mm-hmm. I think taking one step back, and whether it's a fair comment or not, I'd say been in the supply chain space for almost 20 years as both a consultant and within industry, particularly in retail. And I'd say functionally, supply chain operations hasn't changed much over that period of time. Quite interesting, when I came recently out of industry back into consulting, and the same concepts are being sold to clients here in Australia as they were when I first started 20 years ago. So I think digital as a change agent is probably the first major change that I've seen, and I think it is a personal opinion as opposed to maybe fact. Yep. Others may have a different point of view, but we're just seeing that is now a real driver to capability change within the supply chain space. I think there's some other dynamics that are going around that's making supply chain again important to businesses, particularly in retail with e-commerce, but also in FMCG, as businesses look to rationalise and really look at the cost of their operations. So there are some other factors that are driving a focus on supply chain at the moment, but I think digital is sort of one of the answers to where companies can find advantage in the market. As a vision for supply chain, we see this you could break it into 4 pillars in terms of how digital technology is starting to create change and innovate and drive capability enhancement. We see the fact that supply chains, and probably a no-brainer statement, but supply chains are definitely becoming more and more connected. Yep. Proliferation of data and sources of data all along the value chain. IoT in particular is driving that capability. The processing of that data has improved with greater technology, and then visualization and platforms that are required to actually process that and turn that into useful management information are all starting to flow through into the market. IoT, I think, is really finding its space in terms of removing blind flows in supply chains, extended value chains. Most supply chains are fairly extended. It's not just about your own supply chain, but it's about essentially the supply chains that source your products all the way through to either a retailer if you're an FMCG, or to the consumer if you're in the retail space. And that provision of data, much more than there ever has been in the past, whether it's direct data or third-party or fourth-party data, we're all giving you access to information that has the potential to influence and improve your supply chain. Processing that, though, is I guess where one of the most current challenges are arising. You mentioned sort of cognitive capability, machine learning. Yep. So really, all of it is on the basis that there is data available and more informative data. To process that, though, it goes beyond the human capability, or at least we're restricted to a degree in terms of how much human capital we can apply to these problems to generate an outcome. Yep. And technology now is sort of solving that for us at a relatively low cost compared to the alternative of trying to do it with people.
And what sort of technology are you seeing in the market globally?
I think if you break down some of the functional areas, I think forecasting, demand planning and replenishment is sort of one functional area that is really looking at this capability. I think a lot of the major technical players are essentially progressing their own solutions in this space. One of the partners that we currently work with is a company called Era Technology. They sell themselves as essentially a cognitive platform solution that is ultimately leading businesses down a self-driving path. So there's various terms that are being used, lights out planning, black box, cognitive automation, and then ultimately self-driving. And it is a pathway or a roadmap that doesn't happen overnight. So just give you an example of that piece. Access to data is one thing, and I think businesses have traditionally gone down the path of providing management information through big BI projects, which take years to develop. They're never-ending investment, and the customer never really feels like they got what they wanted. These solutions are changing that dynamic to a degree in terms of they have the capability to access data internally and externally in real time, always updating, and with unlimited processing power. So you overlay some visualization capability, whether it's a third-party product or your own, and all of a sudden you've essentially jumped forward beyond BI, and you actually got data that is operationally meaningful and then can be used to actually change what you're doing or provide scenarios to think about what your options are.
And what do you mean by visualization overlay? What specifically do you mean by that? So
where we've got to now, particularly in this cognitive space, is that you can digitise your operation through code. So it's funny that you think about the way coding is treated now. When we were probably going through school and university, green screens, really heavy coding, first principles type work, all of that now has been replaced by building blocks of code that create functions or outcomes. So you don't need to be a data scientist to use these solutions anymore. You can be an operator, and with a simple level of understanding, you can create code that essentially will digitise your operation. So if you think of some sort of flow pathway, if you wanted to describe or define a supply chain in terms of manufacturing locations, source locations of materials, similar to the way an advanced planning and scheduling system used to set things up, nodes that essentially were stock keeping locations or were flow through. You can now do that in these digital platforms with a lot more awareness of the operating function that they perform and the performance expectations. So you build all of that effectively into a model, and then you're sitting that on top of this unlimited access to data, whether it's operational data or external information that can influence your business, your supply chain. And then the cognitive overlay with machine learning can then start to interpret that data. It can start to predict outcomes. It can start to flush through scenarios to help you manage your supply chain based on the outcomes that you've asked it to look at.
It sounds expensive though. You think machine learning, AI, it's all new coming into the supply chain. So it sounds like it's a massive investment. Like, A, is it? And B, what's the return? What's the benefit for actually even looking at this in the first place?
So I think in terms of cost, it is no more expensive than your standard planning software. So I think it always depends on the size of the business, the data that's being pushed through. But it's not an ERP replacement, so it sits well within that cost. Its purpose is to solve problems. So you'd only do this with a value outcome in mind. So these things can only really be sold on a value proposition because they're another system that's being added to the architecture. And in the way things work today, unless you've got a business case or return on that investment, you're not going to do it. So I think that sort of almost solves the cost aspect. And the returns on investment are quite short. So I think in this space, you'd be looking to you get a return within a year or 2 years. It's not like an automation investment where you may be looking at a 5, 10 or 20 year return. This is something much more immediate. And most of the value could become in terms of sales outcomes because you've improved the availability of your product, you've reduced the cost of the product to get it to your customer, you've reduced the level of working capital. So standard first principle supply chain metrics are being enhanced through this capability. The other aspect, which isn't the first driver, but it's certainly a benefit, is that you can reduce the cost of your operation. And again, one example that comes to mind, anecdotal, but very real. In the forecasting replenishment space, again, most big supermarkets globally, whether it's Coles or Woolies or any of the majors, they have hundreds of people in their functional planning areas, particularly for forecasting and replenishment. As an example, with Morrisons in the UK, they've introduced a cognitive planning capability, and that, I guess, has served two outcomes. One, they've got a better availability outcome, and they're seeing it drive directly to sales improvement. Yep. But two, they've solved some of the operating challenges that you have with such a big organisation in that space. Having personally been involved in a big supermarket replenishment organisation, the amount of turnover that you have in the team, in that they're aligned to categories, can be massive. So you're replacing 1 out of 3 every year at least, if not more. And the knowledge that those individuals build up in terms of the specific categories they're planning in is huge. Yep. And the forecasting piece, it's much an art as a science, but it's certainly based on knowledge and experience. You take that out of the business and you're starting again. You can go back 6 months and you can see that actually impact performance. So in digitising this capability within these cognitive platforms, you completely remove the risk of people leaving. And that loss of corporate knowledge.
Well, you don't have the people anymore. Less anyway?
You have a lot less. So the example with Morrisons, they're a big organisation, I think 800 or so stores, and a typical range probably 20, 30,000 SKUs, an planning organisation of probably 100 plus, and they've been able to reduce that significantly in the forecasting space. Anecdotally, they've reduced that to 5 or 10 individuals.
So from 100 down to 5 to 10.
Yeah,
that's massive.
Yeah,
that's huge.
So I think in terms of use cases or applications of this capability, again, it's very functional, and there's problems in every function within the supply chain that you can apply this to. But planning and forecasting is one that I've had direct experience in, and that one you do consume a lot of people. It's a very heavy labour based process. It takes a lot of human thinking to actually get the forecasting right. The application here of a cognitive solution completely removes the risk of churn and transition of knowledge, but also can significantly reduce the cost. You can start to introduce new causal effects that influence your demand that you can never do before. ERP and traditional planning solutions can only really work off 1 or 2 causal pieces of data. This can extend that to many tens. It's just ultimately unlimited, provided you've got good data, good correlations. So it really will transform that piece.
So what can people do? If, you're running a standard replan S&OP process at the moment using standard ERP forecasting tools or some out-of-the-box traditional forecasting tool. What are the first recommendations a supply chain director or COO really needs to do to understand this space and understand how to connect their supply chain?
I think so. There's 2 ways of approaching this. One way is to just understand or have a specific problem or opportunity in mind, and then to apply a solution to that to prove the point. The other way of doing it is to step backwards and look at your full supply chain or value chain and look at a full digital roadmap, which may introduce things beyond just the cognitive planning or operating platform, but start to look at your full digital roadmap. But if you're looking to solve particular problems, which I think is probably the most agile way of doing it and the lowest risk with the least investment, it is probably trying to find that key problem that exists, you could solve if you had greater capabilities. I think an understanding of the technologies that are in play is also important. So informing yourself on what's actually out there, what others are doing, what type of technology decisions can be made is a good entry point. And then I think you're into a proof of concept. So this area is definitely something that lends itself to trial and error and tuning as you progress, and then you're extending into other problem solutions.
With this digitisation wave that's going to come into Australia, well, first of all, is anyone really doing it in Australia yet? That's kind of the first thing. And, you know, what does the talent within supply chain functions need to do to kind of upskill themselves so they, you know, future-proof their jobs for the future? So it's kind of like two very different questions there, sorry.
Yeah. So I think start on, you know, understanding what a supply chain professional or an organisation needs to do to, you know, be in good shape for the changes that are coming with digitisation. I think, you know, based on the areas that are going to change, you know, have more access to data, you know, completely connecting your end-to-end value chain.
Yeah.
So you're going to have complete visibility. You're going to have processing power to do a lot of the administration, but also the cognitive thinking activities that have traditionally sat within specific functional roles within the supply chain. You'll need less of that because technology will fill that service and arguably do a better, more consistent job than what a team of people could do. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a skill set shift, you're going to find less administrative, less basic functional roles in supply chain, and you're going to need managers. You're going to need you know, individuals who understand the system, the value chain, and what are the levers that can be pulled, because these solutions will only operate based on the quality of the data and essentially the you know, the construct of the supply chain as the team has created.
Yeah, and the quality of the data in lots of organisations is pretty average.
I'd say generally it's not in great shape. I think you know, most companies control what they can control, but that's a constant battle because generally, you know, like in most businesses, there's multiple stakeholders responsible for data. Those who care most about it tend to have less control of the data as it comes into the business, and then are constantly trying to fix it. So that data management organisation definitely needs to be in place, and I think it becomes a key asset within any organisation. So I think traditionally where it's been a fairly low level base responsibility in the business, I think immediately becomes much more important. And the introduction of you know, chief digital officers, you know, data is bread and butter, and it's at the highest level of importance for those new functional areas within a business. Skill-wise, I think you know, it's the decision-making capability that's going to be ultimately most important. Understanding of those levers that make a difference within the supply chain, having the ability to act when you need to act, collaborating with the end-to-end organisation, be able to communicate well, socialise options and scenarios, and ultimately move the whole value chain forward. I think they're going to be the base skills of the future supply chain professional. Yeah,
so the intangibles more than the tangibles, the less of the technical skill, more of the stakeholder engagement, getting their buy-in, getting them to understand the information, and then driving the business as a whole to a particular outcome based on the information from the system, basically. Yeah, I think that's right. I think you'll see some highly technical roles that'll form within supply chain that will be specialists, data scientists, and those that really are deep within systems. Mm-hmm. And then you have a higher level management role, or possibly not higher level, but essentially an equivalent level focused purely on, you know, operational outcomes and leveraging the capabilities that you have, but being able to make more informed decisions. And then that's going to come back to those intangibles about being able to influence. Having high emotional intelligence, have good engagement styles, understand different people, what their drivers are, and how, I suppose, the supply chain can support their outcomes as well, which has always been the supply chain goal in a way. But I think lots of supply chain professionals get stuck in the detail and the data and the technical rather than the people, the engagement, the business, and what the business is trying to do in the strategy of the organisation. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think it's creating anything necessarily new, but it's certainly putting an emphasis on those areas that perhaps you could get away with in the past by being, you know, a subject matter expert in a particular area or a technologist, as opposed to someone who's actually running a business effectively. So I reckon that, you know, supply chain professionals almost need to evolve to the next level of leadership to be able to, you know, position themselves for future roles in organisations that actually do digitise. Yeah, I think that's right. And with supply chain, I think almost being renewed
as a key component of an organisation, a business organisation today. That becomes ultimately the path forward to progression, I think, for a professional in the space.
Well, it's an interesting one, and look, we could talk about it for all day, because it's a pretty complex space, and we really kind of concentrated on the cognitive, but there's obviously a number of other things we could talk about. In the essence of time, look, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with me and the audience today, and it sounds like there's going to be a lot of change coming down the line in supply chain.
Yeah, thank you, Iain. I think the next 5 to 10 years, I think, is really going to see some change in the supply chain space, and it's an exciting time to be involved in this area.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Cheers.